Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Colby Kanouse and I'm an attorney here at Chuck Franklin Law. The purpose of this video is to sort of clarify some of the issues that Chuck touched on in his recent video regarding character evidence. Now, if you watch Chuck's video, you know that he basically described the general rule on character evidence. And the general rule is that you don't get to use evidence of prior acts in order to show that a person has a certain character trait and that they probably acted inconsistent with that character trait on the date of the incident. Now, what this basically means is that you can't use character evidence in order to show that someone's a bad guy or a good guy, and that they therefore acted like a good guy or a bad guy on the date of the offense or accident or whatever it happens to be. Now, to give you an example, let's say that a person's charged with burglary and they've been convicted of 2 prior burglaries. The state doesn't get to use the prior convictions in order to show, hey, this guy's a burglar and therefore it's more likely that he burgled this house on this date. Now, there are exceptions to that, though. You can use prior acts evidence for something other than proven character. In other words, you can use it to show identity, modus operandi, which is really identity, knowledge, plan, absence of mistake or accident. Really, you can use other acts evidence for pretty much any purpose other than showing a person's character. Now, to give you an example, let's go back to my burglary example. Let's say that the defendant's charged with burglary and that in his case, the front door to the house was broken into with a lockpick set. And let's assume that that defendant has 2 prior burglary convictions, and both of those convictions arose out of burglaries where both houses were broken into using lockpick sets. In that situation, the state could use those prior acts, the acts of breaking into those houses with lockpick sets, in order to show that this defendant knows how to use lockpicks, and they can use that in order to argue that it's more likely that he committed the burglary at issue. Now, let's talk about an exception to the general rule on character evidence. Like we said earlier, you can't use prior acts in order to prove that a person has a certain character trait for the purpose of showing that they acted in conformity with that character trait on a specific occasion. Now, that's the general rule, and when I say it's the general rule, that means there's exception to the rule. And the exception comes about in sex offense cases. In sex offense cases, if a person has a long history of perverted acts, the state can use those acts in order to show that he has an aberrant sexual propensity, and then they get to argue that it's because he has that sexual propensity, it's more likely that he acted in conformity therewith it on the date of the offense that he's charged with. To give you an example, we'll use the Cosby example because that's one Chuck used. During the Cosby trial, obviously Cosby was accused of sexually assaulting Andrea Constand, and her allegation was that he drugged her and then had non-consensual sex with her while she was unconscious. Now, some of you may have watched that trial or read about it, and if you have, you know that during that trial, the state brought in a bunch of Cosby's accusers, and they all told essentially the same story. Now, because that was a sex offense case, the state got to use all those prior acts in order to show that Cosby had an aberrant sexual propensity. In his case, that he liked having sex with unconscious women without their consent. They then got to argue, based on that evidence, that it was more likely that he did that with Andrea Constand. Now, obviously under the general rule, that's not allowed, but under the exception for sexual offenses, it was allowed. And I would also note that all that prior act evidence in the Cosby trial also could have come in for another reason, mainly that it established a modus operandi, which made it more likely that Cosby was the attacker who had non-consensual sex with Andrea Constand. In other words, he did it the same way every time. It was his signature move, so to speak. And because it was his signature move, it's more likely that he's the one that did the same signature move to Andrea Constand. Folks, this is short. It's sort of a complex subject. I hope that clarifies some things for you. If not, maybe we'll make another video on this soon. But at any rate, thank you for watching. Have a great day.
This posted video is in no way specific legal advice on any subject. It is intended to provide general information for the public. If you need specific legal advice, call Chuck at 480-545-0700.